Hello everyone, and on behalf of Anne Rose, I welcome you to today's webinar towards meaningful engagement, embedding victims and survivors' lived expertise in the co-production of research, policy and practice. My name is Lola and I wear many hats professionally, but I always come back to the core reason for doing what I do, that I am a survivor advocate first and foremost. I have been a public servant and I remain a bit of a policy wonk. I am a social entrepreneur, researcher, activist. I'm a practitioner in gender mainstreaming, primary prevention and anti-patriarchal systems change. All of the work that I do is informed and driven by my lived experience of child sexual abuse and domestic violence and growing up in a country that saw me as an other, less than the norm and an outsider. I believe that the contextual expertise of diverse victim survivors is critical for fit-for-purpose and effective design and delivery of our policies, systems and services to reduce and respond to gendered violence. I acknowledge that the country we meet on today, I am coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. On behalf of Anne Rose and the panel today, I pay my respects to elders past and present. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. And I acknowledge and pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here and participating in this session. Before we start the discussion, I would like to share some housekeeping. Up first is a presentation by Dr. Lisa Wheeldon, who will share the key findings of the research Speaking Truth to Power, the role of victims and survivors in driving policy change on gender-based violence. Following the presentation, we will have a panel discussion followed by a live Q&A. Questions and comments can be submitted into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and please be mindful of each other. Any conduct that is disrespectful will not be tolerated. If you'd like to access the live captions, please click on the CC button on the web page. Oh, sorry, I've lost where I was at. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on Anne Rose website as soon as possible. You can subscribe to the Anne Rose e-newsletter to be notified when it will be available. And finally, Anne Rose have a survey that will be sent via the chat box at the end of the session. If you could please take a couple of minutes to respond to it, we would really appreciate your feedback. Your responses will help in improving Anne Rose webinars in the future. So, speaking about gendered violence and systemic forms of discrimination can be really confronting. And some participants may find elements of what is shared today and what is discussed a little bit distressing. It is important that you take care of yourself and others while watching this webinar and after. If you would like to access support, there are a number of support lines that will be shared in the chat, but just to remind you, they are 1-800-RESPECT, the Men's Referral Service, Lifeline and the First Nations Crisis Support Line 13 Yarn. There has been growth in the work and opportunities for victims and survivors of gendered-based violence in the co-production of research policy and practice recently. The aim of engaging victims and survivors is to ensure that the work of the domestic and family violence sector benefits from their insights and meets their needs. For victim survivors themselves, the purpose is often to help ensure that what we have experienced does not happen to other people. And many victim survivors report doing this work is meaningful and important for their recovery and healing. However, despite this potential for improving outcomes, there can often be a gap between the promise of co-production and what is actually delivered in practice. Today's discussion will unpack new research led by Dr. Lisa Wheeldon, titled Speaking Truth to Power, the role of victims and survivors in driving policy change on gender-based violence. The panel will reflect and share insights from past experiences of co-production and highlight how the system can overcome barriers and look for opportunities to implement and use best practice. I'm going to take a minute now to introduce my lovely panellists and the presenters today. Starting over here, we have Geraldine Bilston, Senior Project Officer, Quality and Risk Team for Family Safety Victoria. Geraldine is well known in this space and highly respected. She has progressed many projects in Victoria, embedding lived expertise into policy and practice, and was previously Deputy Chair of the Victim Survivor Advisory Council for the Victorian Government. Nicole Lee, Survivor Advocate. I don't think anyone could debate that you are a strong campaigner for the prevention of violence against women, particularly women with disability. And Nicole is currently the President of People with Disabilities Australia. Dr. Lisa Wheeldon at Monash University, researcher in criminology at Monash and RMIT. Prior to being a researcher, Lisa has had considerable experience working in policy in the Victorian Government and many other fascinating career projections. And finally, it's really my pleasure to welcome Charlene Campbell to the panel today. She is coordinator of the Tangentyere Women's Family Safety Group. She is a Walpiri and Majera Aranda and Luricha woman, proud woman, from Mpatwi, which is Alice Springs, and member of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Council for the National Plan. So Lisa, could you start by telling us a bit about your research?
I certainly could. Thanks, Lola. First of all, I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the lands we're joining you from today. And I'd also like to thank the policymakers and survivors who contributed to this research on co-producing gender-based violence policy, including Lola and Nicole. Now, I only have 12 minutes, apparently, to present my whole PhD, so I want to get to the findings as quickly as possible. But first, I'd like to briefly explain why I did this research. So, like many, I grew up surrounded by gender-based violence, including domestic and family violence and sexual violence within my extended family, within the communities I live in, and in the places where I worked and studied. I also spent 10 years working in the Victorian Government, so I have a fairly good idea about how the policy process works and just how iterative change can be. It's very often 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. I left government to help establish Our Watch, and I was working there in 2014 when Luke Batty was murdered. I soon came to work with Rosie as an Our Watch ambassador, and I saw her propel the issue of domestic and family violence to the top of the public agenda in Australia like never before, as the Google Trends data here indicates. I wanted to understand the nature of that influence and find out what we could learn from that to end the prevalent and persistent problem of gender-based violence. The focus, as it turns out, is now very timely because survivors are increasingly asking to be heard in the development of policy, and as we now see in the National Plan, policymakers have begun to realise the value of lived experience too. Co-production with service users in other areas, including disability and mental health areas, has been going on for some time, and evaluations are starting to reveal promising practice, including a range of benefits for those involved, the service users involved in co-production. However, there's a lack of research available on survivors' role in policy co-production and the best ways to engage them. And that's where this research that I'm presenting today comes in. As it says here, the aim of my research is to establish a knowledge base regarding the best role or the optimal role for survivors in the co-production of GBV policy and the most effective mechanisms for engagement. On the left here, you will see that the research is made up of 3 studies, each study building on the other, from the individual to the institutional level and then the community level. The first 2 studies are case studies, one on Rosie Batty and the other on the Victorian Government's Victim Survivors Advisory Council, or VSAC. And the third is narrative research on survivors' perspectives regarding what works in driving policy reform. The studies are based on in-depth interviews with policymakers, Rosie Batty, and a diverse range of often marginalised survivors. The studies are also informed by analysis of government, independent and media reports. And as you can see on the right, my approach was interdisciplinary. I took a feminist qualitative approach to the research and found that the literature identifies significant barriers for survivors involved in co-production efforts. So if we look at the history of the victims' rights movement, it shows that victims are often used by the media and by politicians to promote agendas that aren't always in their interests. And there's also a theory about ideal victims and victim blaming, which tells us that only some victims attract community compassion. And then there's feminist and Indigenous theories regarding the ways that state institutions reflect and reinforce patriarchal and colonial power imbalances. Now, most of you will know that Rosie Batty had an extraordinary impact, particularly in Victoria, generating community support for action on family violence, changing the public discourse about family violence, and inspiring a royal commission, which ultimately led to the multi-billion-dollar reform of Victoria's family violence system. Media called this the Batty effect. And Rosie also worked out of the public spotlight, including as the inaugural chair of VSAC from 2016 to 2019, and she continues to work to end family violence today. So, to the juicy bit, the findings. What I found was an extraordinary convergence of social, political and historical factors that came together to bring about the Batty effect, and I'll talk about just 3 of those factors now. Firstly, international studies of individuals who've promoted significant policy change have found that they tend to have similar attributes and employ similar strategies. And the interviews I did with Rosie and policymakers revealed that Rosie possessed most of those attributes and used many of those same strategies, including building networks of people with the expertise needed to bring about the change required, as the quote from Rosie on the left here indicates. Next, political science scholars have found that it's increasingly difficult for policymakers to bring about reform from within government, and that it's increasingly common that change is coming from external agents positioned outside the regular policy-making context. In Rosie's case, the fact that she wasn't from government or from the violence against women sector meant she could cut through what one policy actor called institutional protectiveness. As the quote in the middle reflects, Rosie found being an outsider beneficial. Another finding that I want to highlight just briefly is the importance of the decades of work of the women's movement in creating the conditions for change. The work of the women's movement and what Hester Eisenstein called femocrats in organisations such as Vic Health meant that within the violence against women sector and within the Victorian government, there was a workforce with an understanding of the drivers of gender-based violence and of what needed to change. And they were ready to swing into action when a window of opportunity opened up. As the quote on the right from Rosie reflects, this is work that often goes unrecognised, so that social change can appear sudden, and it's only when you scratch beneath the surface that you find the decades of work that went into creating the foundations for change. So ultimately, the Batty effect case study indicates that Rosie played a key role in bringing about the reform of Victoria's family violence system. While there were contributing factors that helped bring change about, Rosie has distinct capabilities that made her an influential change agent. So some of the implications from this study are the need to encourage and support survivor independence in order to maximise survivors' influence and the creation of public or shared value. There's also value in bringing together networks of people with a range of skills, including lived experience. And there's also, this study also highlights the importance of social movements and the value of supporting the work that they do. And finally, there's value in training survivors to develop new capabilities so that they can be more effective advocates and so that they understand the policy making and co-production processes and the contexts they're working within. Next, on to case study 2. So the first 3 years of VSAC. VSAC was established in response to a recommendation from Victoria's Family Violence Royal Commission that government identify and develop safe and constructive ways to ensure the voices of victims are heard and inform policy development and service delivery. The idea of establishing a group of survivors as ongoing advisors to government within government was a major step forward and the first of its kind in Australia, and it's generated interest right around the world. Like the inclusion of service users' voices in other areas of policy development, it was intended to be a more effective way of delivering public value. However, a significant theme from the interviews with Rosie and policymakers in the first study was the government's lack of preparation and adequate support for VSAC. And the policymakers I spoke to were really committed to ensuring that others learned from their experiences. The concerns I heard raised raised questions about the risks of engaging survivors in co-production efforts and how those risks might be addressed to ensure that, first of all, survivors are safe, secondly, that a diverse range of survivors' voices are heard, and thirdly, to make sure that better policies and services are actually delivered. Interestingly, the issue raised also reflects a growing body of academic literature from around the world regarding the risks involved in co-production, particularly with people from marginalised communities and particularly when there are significant power balances in place. So one risk that came up repeatedly in the interviews was the lack of trauma-informed support for the members of VSAC and the lack of preparation and support for the public servants working with the survivors, as the statement here on the left from a policymaker reflects. The next risk that came up frequently in the interviews with policymakers was a lack of clarity and consensus around VSAC's role. As one policymaker observed, I think there was a misunderstanding that members thought they were coming to be reformers as opposed to the input to the reforms. Ultimately, this lack of role clarity and the wide range of roles that VSAC came to assume placed pressure on council members and those working with them, leading to distress and conflict. The reinforcement of inequalities and power imbalances was also particularly relevant. Rosie explained that she felt members of VSAC weren't treated as equals. Every one of us, she said, in this group, we want to hold our own and be treated as equals, and I think there's a perception that you should be subordinate. Finally, and on a more positive note, a finding to emerge from the study was the importance of the work of resisting, reforming and adapting formal and informal institutional rules which reinforce power imbalances. As the fourth quote here indicates, the VSAC Secretariat did a lot of this work, and while this internally focused work might often be undervalued, it is the work of institutional change. So to sum up the findings of this study, or the implications of this study, clear roles and responsibilities are absolutely critical. Roles, responsibility and decision-making rights need to be clearly defined. There must be trauma-informed support available for survivors, and ideally there should be specialist trauma support inbuilt into the teams supporting survivors. Policymakers and service providers working with survivors need to be trained in co-production so that they have a deep understanding of its benefits and so that they can apply best practice mechanisms. They also need trauma support to avoid or address vicarious trauma themselves or amongst others. And it's also really important that those working with survivors are encouraged to identify internal barriers to meaningful engagement with survivors. It should be in their PDs. They need to be supported to challenge bureaucratic, patriarchal systems and processes that reinforce power imbalances, and they need to be encouraged to do things differently. Okay, on to the final study. So study 3 focuses on survivors' perspectives on what works, with a particular focus on the voices of survivors of GBV that we don't often hear. That's Indigenous women, incarcerated women, women with disability, trans women, gay men, survivors of child sexual abuse, migrant women, etc. All of the survivors who participated in this study are named with their permission. And while this is unusual in academic work, I felt it was important to give survivors the choice about whether or not to make their contribution visible. First, I found that most of the research participants interviewed had developed a preference over time as a result of their advocacy and activism experiences for working outside state institutions as activists, although this wasn't a straightforward decision, and there was great respect for others who chose to play a role as inside advocates. Ultimately, though, most felt that they could bring about more change outside, and this was felt to be most important for those from the most marginalised communities. Nina, who's a current member of VSAC and refers to herself as a proud and unapologetic criminalised woman, emphasised that marginalised survivors have very different and often large issues that they want to see addressed. She stated that they are far more likely to demand more radical systemic change and are therefore likely to come into conflict with the state. As her statement on the top left demonstrates, I feel like I go there to VSAC and it's like I'm screaming underwater or I'm running into a brick wall because the change I would like to see, it's just not possible. Another finding was regarding the value of collective action. Those who had been involved in collective action outside government found it to be rewarding and enriching. Collective action can help ensure diverse voices are heard and can reduce divisions between survivors who, instead of competing to have their issue heard, are brought together around a shared goal. As the quote on the top right reflects, Deborah, who's from Tasmania, described campaigning as a group to have a standalone offence of non-fatal strangulation introduced in Tasmania as her greatest achievement. Another benefit of collective action and survivor networks is the support of peers, which emerged in the study as incredibly important in helping overcome the isolation and victim blaming survivors can often experience. Aboriginal woman Fiona highlighted the healing power of her experience working with other Aboriginal women who'd experienced domestic violence in the Northern Territory. She went there to help them, but found the experience helped her too. Training and the development of new capabilities also emerged as key for survivors, particularly in helping share their lived experience in a way that focuses on what needs to change rather than on the traumatic details of the violence and abuse they've experienced. Several survivors mentioned the benefits of the Voices for Change media advocacy program and reported that the greatest benefit of the training was the network of other survivors it helped them establish, as well as the Change the Story framework, which helped them understand the drivers of violence against women and relieved them of blame, as the quote from Louisa on the bottom left reflects. So the findings of the study reinforce the influence of survivors as outsiders who can overcome institutional divides and motivate stakeholders around key objectives. This is something policymakers and others can support through funding survivor networks and advocacy training for survivors. The study also highlights the power of collective action in bringing together the voices of diverse survivors and thereby challenging the stereotype of the ideal victim. Tapping into those networks is a great way for policymakers to ensure they're hearing diverse voices representative of the breadth of survivors' experiences. The study also highlights the power of peer support, training and empowerment. Survivor advocates benefit from being prepared to tell their story in a way that gives them control, is focused on bringing about change and avoids re-traumatisation. Survivor advocates can also benefit from assistance to deal with backlash and trolls. They benefit from understanding the drivers of GBV and that they are not to blame and that they're not alone. They also benefit from being part of networks of people with diverse expertise, and they benefit from genuine trauma-informed support. In conclusion, I'd like to wrap up with this quote from Ursula Le Guin, the author, about the power of speaking out. When women speak truly, they speak subversively. They can't help it. If you're underneath, if you've kept down, if you're kept down, you break out, you subvert. We are volcanoes. When women offer our experience as our truth, as human truth, all the maps change. There are new mountains. So just finally, there's immense value for policymakers, practitioners and researchers in listening to people's lived experiences of policies and systems and to their ideas about what needs to change. But we must be prepared to cede power, to be challenged, to learn and ultimately to change ourselves and the institutions and the systems we work within. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm reminded each time I read some of your research about how much it resonates with my own experience, and really that point on independence for survivor advocacy is really critical. Training in policy and co-production, having networks of diverse people with diverse skills, the recognising the power imbalances within structures, that they aren't equal, the frustration of change not happening fast enough or feeling like the change we want to achieve is really unlikely to happen in our lifetimes, and the resistance from institutions to do things differently. I've been reflecting recently that I keep having the thing in my head that, you know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So we actually have to be working with those institutions to change, even if it is incremental. Small things matter, and we can make it grow from there. So Nicole and Charlene, you both have a breadth of experience in lived expertise, advocacy and co-production across the sector. I'm going to come to you first, Nicole. Can you tell us about these experiences and how were challenges of co-production overcome to embed lived experience?
Well, I think to begin with, it was really quite difficult, and because nobody was really, as Lisa was saying, prepared to do what it was that we were trying to do, and everybody trying to see where they fitted into the ecosystem, how to do this. Like, I'd never done any advocacy work before. I'd never engaged with the sector. I'd certainly never engaged with government before, and didn't know who half the people were that I was speaking to. So I think I might have given a few sharp words to the Special Minister of State in a meeting, not knowing who he was, but it actually gained his respect in that process. But one of the things that we did early on with VSAC is we had dedicated roles when they were back at the branch in DPC, and Rebecca Falkenham had set up these roles for us to work alongside policymakers in the branch, on a day-to-day basis. And it was kind of like this really beautiful marrying of the policy work and the person with lived experience being able to advocate to that person on hand all day, every day kind of thing. It's like having an advisory council on hand at any point in time across the course of the day. That was really good. But then, that the next budget came in and it all moved over to Family Safety Victoria, and whether they didn't have budget to do it and it didn't move forward. But that was probably the most useful part of the work that I did with VSAC, was working in there alongside them, being able to bounce ideas, fact check things, just validate things for them from that kind of outsider perspective. But sort of, moving forward, it was a lot of argy-bargy in that room. You've got a room full of trauma. Nobody knew how to deal with it. Not all, some of us were in fight mode, some of us were defensive, and it's that learning of, you can't stop that from happening. You can't control the trauma in the room. You just have to be prepared for it to happen and be ready to work with it and work around it and to work with the people involved in it. And I think there was a big kind of, to start with, a bit of cotton wooling in wanting to, prevent it from happening. The thing is, you can't. It's an automatic reaction for people because these things are so passionate. But like moving on, the more I got involved in things, and it was being able to be actually embedded within a design team, working with them from the very beginning. So I did the portable app with your case, with Portable, and I was there, a couple of days a week working with them as an actual designer, being given training around what is UX design, what is iterative design. So I understood what that was, and being like from start to finish, the whole entire process, and embedded as a designer. And then getting to work with the design team within Family Safety Victoria at one point, not as the person with lived experience, but just as an actual designer who has that kind of lived experience perspective. That's where you get the value, where you actually embed people into things versus, we've developed this thing, now we want your advice on it. And that's not really that co-production. And I think that was something that was misplaced time and time again, because they just really didn't know what they were doing. And we were able to slowly, I'm not sure what it's like now, but it was sort of moving towards kind of those bits and pieces and identifying people that could fit into a design team and work collaboratively with them. But it certainly was a process, a learning process, and a lot of observing, watching, listening, understanding of the history from Phil Cleary, being in the room, who's got over 30 years worth of knowledge in the sector, and advocating it on behalf of his sister, and just learning the history and being able to respect the history as well, and how all of that fits and where I fit and we fit in the ecosystem of reform and co-production and co-design. It's definitely something that has evolved. Whether or not we're there yet, I honestly don't think that we are. I think there's so much work to do around how do you embed lived experience without causing damage, or without trying to clip their wings, so to speak, because we need things done in a certain way. It's been a challenge, and it's going to ongoingly be a challenge moving forward, and it's something that will continue to evolve, and it's happening in multiple sectors. If we go to the mental health sector, it's something where it's been embedded quite well for a long time. They're far more advanced on this than we are. But the disability sector is trying to sort of bring in that sort of lived experience, that nothing about us without us kind of sentiment. But how does that then fit with government when we're usually the ones with the voice that's not welcome in those spaces? We don't usually make it in as politicians. We don't make it into those decision makers. positions, and how are we being respected, and raising that bar and raising that level. And I think there has to be a piece in all of this around upskilling of survivors. Not all of us are coming in with great education. Like, I hadn't finished high school, I failed out of high school, I hadn't been to university by the time I just kind of got myself into uni at that point in time, a scary prospect. But I didn't have that education piece behind me. I didn't have a lot of knowledge and information. And part of bringing lived experience in is working with them to go, okay, well, there's these courses, how can we upskill? What are you interested in studying, where we can actually give back to you so that you're not then stuck in this lived experience co-design role, that we all want career progression. We don't want to be stuck there on a council talking about the worst things of our lives. We actually want to, progress in these positions to be able to position our lived experience on a much broader policy way. And one of the things that needs to be embedded, or hopefully has been embedded, is that supporting people to identify ways of upskilling so that we can have career progression just like everybody else, and move on from that just purely the lived experience council kind of position.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognise where systems do incidentally or deliberately box you in, and it was really interesting for me to hear that it started with an embedded position and then moved to an advisory role. And I think distinction between and clarity and transparency about the influence of your role is a really positive thing to understand. And I know that there's work going on in that space right now to educate people to say, okay, look at what you're doing. Where does this fit in the paradigm of what could be a co-design process?
Those roles were very radical. They were really radical, and I think that created a bit of fear. It was they weren't quite sure of how to do it properly or how to embed that safely and succinctly, and so we knew what we were doing. And it was very radical, and I'd like to see like a major return to that, where you've got your Victorian Public Service and then you've got the Victorian Public Voice, and they sit beside each other. So rather than every 6 weeks you go to an advisory council, every day you've got the advisory council on hand, when you need them, as you need them.
Those designated lived experience roles, I think that's something we need to work on. Charlene, what has your experience been in the range of work of co-production? Have you had similar challenges or different?
I guess mine was a bit different. I grew up in a grassroots development of Tangentyere Council that was made up by two role models who we kind of looked up to elderly people. They were males. Having males to kind of guide that as well, because they're always our teachers. So Tangentyere is made up of 16 town camps, and at the time of having those town camps, well, before it was, we wanted a voice for our town campers. So the development of our two elderly men have created Tangentyere Council was kind of a grassroots, because knowing that developing a council that we needed to have that voice, but it still wasn't a voice, but we're still doing a lot of the stuff. And then we also developed the, then about the Tangentyere Women's Family Safety Group. We are the primary prevention program group of women. At the time we were voted in as the president of our town camps. I guess it was, again, felt like it was a moment of time of all women coming together, because we've had a woman sitting on an executive board at the time, coming together in a range of voices, different expertise and languages. Then we kind of created the Tangentyere Family Violence Prevention Program team at Tangentyere. So we developed and designed the Tangentyere Family Violence Program. Under that sits, well, we're kind of like the blanket and the umbrella of the program that we developed underneath. So because we needed an opportunity and also come up with help co-design to create a men's behavioural change program, because we didn't have any at the time. We were all screaming out because the prison system, the justice system, were just filling up with all our men. Not all men use violence. I just want to say that out there, because we do love our black men, doesn't matter who they are. But, creating a men's behavioural change, I guess it was one of the first in kind in the Northern Territory that we developed and kind of helped strategically form the men's behavioural change. Then after that, we kind of started thinking, now we needed to think about our children's, because if we're going to talk about focus on our men here, and yet we, the women here, are having that voice in the conversation, what about our children? So we kind of looked at the centre and made them in the centre as well. So we kind of developed a domestic violence youth specialist court. So what that is where young people now are entering into relationships and not knowing that violence is not a good and a healthy way to live. So with having the domestic violence youth specialist courts, when they're experienced violence and then they're both going to courts, we actually got someone there supporting them and educating them around family and domestic violence and sexual assault. But it's also talking about the meaningful of respect in the relationship as well. So after that, talking about and developing all that, we've just sort of realised, yes, we need to kind of create our young women's safety group, because we hear a lot at the schools, in the education department, like that. I mean, the colleges and stuff, that women are, our young girls are kind of putting up with all these negativities and supporting them and educating them how to be strong within themselves. Because without having to respect yourself, how are you going to respect others and get the respect back? So again, with that, we're also having the big education around that. We've also developed and designed the Tangentyere Family Violence Project, which is called Mums Can, Dads Can. Again, that's flipping that rigid gender role stereotype in the role in the household, having that conversation at the table, because, you know, we have this conversation not at the table, but around the campfires. Around that, after developing Girls Can, Boys Can, Mums Can, Dads Can, we came up with, well, here are our adults again, but again, these are our kids we've got to think about, so we've developed Girls Can, Boys Can. Again, that's kind of teaching them how to respect themselves, and I guess educating our younger generations around family and domestic violence. And also with Girls Can, Boys Can, we're kind of wanting to vastly implement it in the Northern Territory curriculum, because around that, it's not only about the respectful relationship, but it's around gender inequality. And talking about that stuff, we also developed and designed the resources partly from the Tangentyere Family Violence Prevention Program. We developed the Family Violence Card. I've directed a documentary, Not Just Numbers, talking about my women's group and how to start their own group in their own communities, no matter who or where you are. And then we've also created resources like posters, T-shirts, stickers, water bottles for our kids, a lot of that stuff now. Then we use our lived experience to advocate and influence government and gender and media coverage about men's violence against women and children.
And I think, you know, I've seen some of the more recent reporting that's been happening, and it's really finally starting to get the attention that it's deserving of. And I would encourage anyone who doesn't know the Tangentyere, great T-shirts, water bottles, everything, go and find them. They're online. They're amazing work and a great way to show your support from a distance. So Geraldine, I'm going to condense the next two questions, which start with you. I made the transition out of the public service into advocacy. You've done the opposite, but you've also done the transitional piece through VSAC into the public service.
Yes.
And I just wanted to understand what's been your thoughts and experiences of that, and also get you to reflect on, you know, we heard a lot from Nicole about the language of co-design. We have positions, we have advisory councils. It's a lot of buzzwords. What do they actually mean for you in practice?
Yeah. Thanks, Lola. So yes, as you mentioned, at the beginning of 2022, after my own term on VSAC, I was given a pathway into the public service and to work within government. I wanted to start by just outlining and speak a little bit about the years preceding that time, where I was participating as a survivor advocate in a number of different places, but in particular, I was sharing a lot of myself and a lot of my experience of intimate partner violence publicly, and including within the media. And I think when I think about that, I'm really proud of that advocacy work, and I think it really helps people understand the psychological impacts of domestic abuse and It really exposed some of those deep soul wounds that can occur when a woman is abused and violated by somebody that she loves and trusts. But I think doing that, it really took a toll on me, and they were really difficult years for me. And when I started to think about and explore opportunities to continue contributing to this work, but in different ways, and think about what the long-term sustainable ways to contribute to this work would be for me, I really quickly realised that one of the unintended consequences of my own advocacy was that it had affected people's ability to be able to see my professional potential in this work. And I began to feel very trapped as a survivor advocate and felt people couldn't see me beyond my story. And so I guess being given this opportunity to come and work within government has been a real gift in my life. It has for sure been a challenging transition, and in a lot of ways I'm still navigating that and still finding my feet in that space. But I also want to say I'm very proud of what I have achieved over the last year and a half, and what I want people to know about me today is that I am more than just my story, and I will continue to show up in spaces like this, in conversations like this, in my work and in my workplace to say that survivors are capable of doing more than just recounting the worst moments of our lives. And I will not let anyone make the worst thing that happened to me be the most interesting thing about me. For me, my professional success in this space is becoming my act of resistance against the long-term effects of domestic abuse. I do want to take this opportunity to thank the leadership team at Family Safety Victoria. I think on an individual level, when they gave me this pathway into government, they gave me my career back. But on a wider level, I think that they also sent a message, and that is that survivors belong, that we can belong not just on advisory groups and councils, but that we can also belong in this work, leading this work, and we can even belong within government. I think we've started to really put into practice a commitment to creating a workforce that represents the people and the communities that we want to serve. It's been really exciting for me to have opportunities to not just have a seat at the table within government, but also work on projects that create other seats and other opportunities for survivors to be part of this work. You mentioned Codesign, and yes, I think it is this, like, becoming this buzzword that a lot of people use, but I think what is important is that we understand for a project to be truly co-designed with victim survivors, then survivors need to be part of not just highlighting the problems, but also be part of the work in creating the solutions. And that means being sharing power and having ownership in each stage of a project. I think that when we think about lived experience engagement, we can sort of think about this spectrum of participation and co-designs at the top. But I think it's really important that we're kind of honest about the realities of our work, and it won't always be possible for every project to be co-designed. But I think what I would like to see is for us to have a commitment as professionals to be actively thinking about where in our work can we benefit from the input of people with lived experience. And I think as professionals, you may be the content experts, but victim survivors can really provide that context expertise. And that partnering of that work together, I think that takes real planning and resourcing. And one of the ways that we can improve is getting better at putting that in place in the early stages of our work.
Thank you. I think we've heard from the three wonderful survivor advocates today about how the diversity of the work can occur. It can start from a need that is seen from people, and it evolves through one program into another and gives voice and gives evidence and says this is what we need. It can start from the top down, realising they need to include people, but maybe not loving the challenges that brings, and also then coming back to how we can evolve and work through not limiting victim survivors to being, and I'll use the language of trauma porn, or just limited to our story, and then not seeing the potential and the utility and the meaning that lived experience can provide to this work. So Lisa, did you have any thoughts about co-design and co-creation and the range of ideas and ways of working that we've covered?
Yeah, sure. I think Geraldine made a great point that it's very important that survivors, when engaged in whatever it is, whichever of the co's it might be, that it's made clear which co it is, whether it's co-production, whether it's just engagement, or whether it's co-creation. I think it's really important that that's made clear to people. And I do think that, as Nicole said, I think it's kind of beholden on policymakers to return that kind of gift of survivor expertise with capability building. And it's not only crucial for survivors to be able to develop new skills, but it's really important to ensure that the best kind of public value is delivered, that genuinely improved policies and services are developed. And I think that only happens when survivors feel comfortable, they understand the context they're working within, they understand what they have decision-making rights on, what they're able to influence. So, yeah.
And I would like to take this moment to just recognise the work of other survivor advocates such as the Weavers at the University of Melbourne. I'm fortunate to participate in that, and as we're speaking about what it means to participate, to advise, to co-produce, there is a new framework on the ethical co-production, working with lived experience with survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence that has been developed, which does articulate some of these the participation continuum. So if you are working in this space and you want to engage with lived experience, it's a really great tool for you to look at, to understand, where does my work fit on this? It has reflective tools, reflective questions for you to think about how you want to engage, and also how to do it ethically, because we do need to look at, when we're using lived experience, not only that it's important we do that for fit for purpose and better outcomes, but actually how do we do that so that the benefit isn't limited to something external to the people who inputted to it. We need to be providing a benefit from gender equality, mainstreaming lens, who benefits when matters, and that matters across the board. And so if you can really provide outcomes that are beneficial to the people participating, not just in what you produce, then that's another way to live by those values and do the work really well. Shifting gears a little bit, we're going to come into some of the findings of Lisa's work and focus now on how do we challenge the stereotypes of the ideal victim to ensure that we do create space for marginalised communities. Charlene, I'm going to look to you first to say, what mechanisms can we put in place to do that?
Sorry, what was the question?
How do we challenge the stereotypes of the ideal victim? And as I understand it from literature and from the Australian experience, but also the US experience in the victims movement, it's often the crying white woman, the woman who is seen as vulnerable, needs to be taken care of, and it doesn't recognise that victims can be angry, we can be powerful, and that, the dimensions of discrimination also layer there as to who is seen and who is valued. So that, we know in Australia the stories of murdering white women hit the headlines every time. We're not seeing that same value provided to our Indigenous women who are being killed all the time, unfortunately, and don't get that same recognition. So how can we shatter those ideas of who is an ideal victim?
I guess it's talking about the visibility in our Aboriginal women. As women, we all experience sexism. I'm talking all women's across the sector, and right around the world. But for Aboriginal women, we experience racism. And, we have the support of Aboriginal men on the Tangentyere board, because we share the same lived experience of racism with those men who are our families. Again, sometimes there is backlash, and it is a combination of racism and sexism. So we have been educating people through our primary prevention projects, Mums Can, Dads Can, Girls Can, Boys Can, about the drivers of violence against Aboriginal women, which are gender inequality, racial inequality, and due to colonisation. It's about education, educating each other every day, no matter who you are, young or old, no matter what background you come from. Because at the end of the day, we're all aiming to kind of want the best for our generation. Again, when I talk about education, things not going to change overnight, but we have 3 simple messages. We want everybody to listen to us, stand with us, and support us. And just wanted to say that.
No, absolutely. And I think, if I might, take this opportunity to put the media on the line and hold them accountable for doing that work. Listen, stand by and support. It isn't just about the snappy who's going to get the most clicks and likes, but it actually needs to be substantive and really reflective of what's going on in this country to be meaningful. Nicole, did you have anything to add to that?
Just to really reflect what you've just said around that whole visibility piece for people from diverse communities who don't normally make the headlines, that we do experience rates of violence that are much higher than other areas of the community. So, and it's that layering effect. So some of the really good work that helped me give language was the Our Watch Changing the Landscape work that I did with Jen Hargraves, who's one of my go-to people to bounce ideas off and double check, why do I feel this way, kind of thing, for women with disabilities and for other diverse communities that have disabilities as well. It's the intersection of gender inequality and ableism, and then you add on racism and then homophobia and different cultural backgrounds and the impacts that they experience. But how that gender inequality and ableism plus the different elements of someone's diversity create these environments where we're not seen as the ideal victim. For women with disabilities, putting it out there that I'm not a quiet person. I am a reactive person. I can get quite assertive. That not all victims go passive. We're not all the quiet people. That some of us will become quite assertive. Some of us will speak up, speak out, defend ourselves, defend our communities, and defend what's happening for us. Especially when we're not getting listened to, that's when we tend to get very, very defensive, and we will fight for our community to be heard. And sometimes that's met with opposition, or sometimes that's met with people feeling confronted. Oh, wow, survivors can get really quite, aggressive. And it's like, well, if you keep pushing people down, they're going to push back on you. And, that's just some of our responses. That's our innate, internal, just, automatic responses as part of a survival mechanism. And the other part of it is the ideal victim and challenging the language that is used around different diverse communities. So for women with disabilities, the most vulnerable in the community, that doesn't actually state what that vulnerability is. It just says that we are. I am not a vulnerable person, but the situations the world around me and the community around me put me in, and the same for other diverse communities and for older people, we are not vulnerable. It's the situations that we're actually placed in that create those vulnerabilities. So we need to stop looking for ways to make people perfect victims or it's and even the language around when we say things like innocent victims. Well, what are we implying when we say, all of these innocent victims? And I think that was at the Christchurch massacre, and we said, all these poor innocent victims. But are we saying there are less innocent victims by using that language and being really careful when we say innocent victims? Does that mean that there's victims that aren't innocent?
Or deserving.
Or deserving, or, due to mental health, due to being too, outspoken or aggressive in your responses, therefore you're somehow responsible for what happened to you, or you're a deserving victim. You're still a victim, but you're just deserving of it. And that language really sort of, cements that ideal victim narrative within the public that we all need to be part of challenging. And that's where having as many survivor voices from many communities speaking up, but then also managing that expectation. Not all survivor voices, and I've spoken to so many survivors that, oh, my story didn't take off. It didn't run with the media. Everybody didn't grab it and run with it. That doesn't mean that their story wasn't have value. It doesn't mean it's not validated. It doesn't mean that it didn't belong there or it's not needed. It just means, trying to manage that expectation for survivors that when they tell their story, that sometimes, there's the very rare few that make it to that top, and that's where we have to challenge media about that and media cycles. That Rosie, Grace Tame, and Brittany Higgins, that those stories kind of took off. But that doesn't mean somebody else's story isn't as valuable to hear, because we need more of the diverse communities out there. We need more of everyone. So I can only tell my experience. I can't tell somebody else's experience. So that's where we need other people's experience being told. And just because it's not the next media sensation doesn't mean it's not valuable, and doesn't mean it's not valid.
Absolutely, and I think we've seen a progression from understanding survivor advocacy to be very media focused, and actually now we're trying to go, well, actually, how do we use lived experience and translate that expertise into meaningful change so that it's more than a headline, and also to recognise that, you know, media may have an immediate sense of validating, but there's so many other ways to make your work
challenging media
meaningful.
telling your story, and Nina Fresnel was really brilliant with this. Working with her to tell my story and saying, I don't want to wrap this up in a neat bow for everybody at the end, that everything worked out and I'm kicking goals and my recovery is great, because that sets an unrealistic expectation for other survivors that go, I'm not as recovered as you. And having to say to people privately, like, I'm sorry, well, I'm not as recovered as you either. It's okay. Yeah. That's just what the media is told. So I was really careful around, I'm not going to tie this up in a neat bow for you. I'm going to let you sit with that discomfort, that all of this bad stuff happened, and this bad stuff's going to continue to happen unless you listen to these takeaways. So it's really positioning, I'm telling you this story, and these are the reasons why, and this is what I want you to take away from it and influence and actually make change with this. Otherwise, it's just trauma for trauma, and we're saying, all these bad things happened, oh, but she overcame at the end and it's all brilliant and wonderful and roses. That's not reality, and that doesn't bring change. It just makes people feel better about their lives. It doesn't push.
Form of the ideal victim.
Yeah,
because
it is.
You made yourself right again and everything's okay and it's rosy.
And it doesn't push that change piece for government. It doesn't actually put the pressure on them. It actually gives them an out. Oh, well, they're recovering anyway,
That's
so
right,
we don't need to do too much.
And to be clear, when I said rosy, I meant, you know, looking at the world through rose-coloured glasses, not the incredible Rosie Batty. So we're seeing a lot of interest. As you can see, there's been a lot of work happening. We've seen different developments. What do you, Geraldine, think has been the most valuable development recently?
I think that there is, certainly this increased interest in valuing and embedding lived experience within the family violence space. I want to start by saying that I think this interest and this thinking should not be occurring as some type of add-on or something separate to our core work in this space, and that it certainly shouldn't be done out of some type of moral obligation. I think what we need to see happen is a shift in our thinking to seeing lived experience as crucial to our core work in this space. And I think the most important development is that we can truly understand that we will not create services and systems that meet the needs of the people that use them without having the people involved in the work. Sounds really simple, but I think that that's what needs to occur. I also want to say that I think it's a good time to acknowledge the good work of Safe and Equal. They have the Experts by Experience framework as well as the Sources of Lived Experience paper, and those I think are really great resources for people in sector that are looking to progress this work.
Absolutely, they are great resources. I use them myself in my work, and I, again, encourage them. They're on the website. So I just want to understand, it seems like a no-brainer to include people with lived experience, to find out what they need and then deliver it to meet their needs. But as we've spoken about, there are a lot of barriers to doing that work well. Lisa, how do you think that we can overcome some of those barriers, and particularly the over-reliance, I guess, that comes about expecting people with lived experience to volunteer their time, to be like, well, you believe in this, or you're really passionate about this, so you'll just do it out of the good of your heart, and not recognising that that is actually a pretty exploitative way to work. So what can we do to change that?
I think Geraldine's just highlighted it, but to perhaps speak in more policy wonk terms, if you like, you're just not going to maximise the public value. You're not actually really going to genuinely improve services or policies without listening, and listening takes up people's time, so they need to be paid for it. They need training and support, as we've discussed. So it's, to talk like an economic rationalist, you're going to maximise public value by spending some funding on investing in genuine co-production. I think it can, I think that's the argument to the policy wonks. And then, of course, it's the right thing to do. I don't think people ring up accountants and say, can you come in and do our papers for us for free? It certainly doesn't happen in government. So Nobody should be expected to do things for free. And as I think I mentioned in my presentation about the VSAC Secretariat as well, sometimes doing this work is really difficult because we have structures, particularly within government institutions, but other institutions as well, which limit the way that we pay people. So a council structure like the Victim Survivors Advisory Council within the Victorian government was potentially borrowed from an idea which is more traditionally being used to bring in predominantly male experts who are coming in a professional capacity to represent an organisation they're already getting paid by. And so it took a while, apparently, for the VSAC Secretariat to be able to manipulate systems and processes to be able to pay people. So that sort of internal change is really important, and it shouldn't be diminished. Like, I think sometimes that work gets overlooked, the importance of that work, but it's really crucial. It is the work of institutional change, and it's just the sort of change that we need to see happen to end gender-based violence.
Yeah, and it takes a little bit of accountability and a little bit of challenging sometimes from the outside to say, hey, how are you going to do this? What can you do? Yes, okay, your procurement system may not be set up for that, but what can you use in the system? Who do you need to get approval from? And just push that little bit extra. It helps if you have knowledge of how the policy systems work to be able to do that, but it is possible, and it's been my experience that there are a lot of good people who will try where they can. I'm just conscious of time right now, so I'm going to turn to learning from other ways of working. So we've spoken about a lot of institutional work in a very, white, patriarchal, colonial way of working in Australia. I'd love to understand what else has been going on, and particularly in the Indigenous space. I'm aware that there's been all of the work happening to do broad consultation on the first national plan or national strategy for Indigenous people, the First Nations plan, the action plan. Charlene, I understand you've been involved in that. So what can we learn from Indigenous practice to shift how the work happens in those really institutions of white male dominance?
Well, like Lisa said, we definitely should absolutely be paying people. What we do in the Tangentyere Women's Family Safety Group is pay our women for their time and their expertise, because we don't want to bring them in and just use them and then, just use the stories, but we actually want them to come in and use listen to their expertise as well. Sitting fees are factored into the budget and should be seen as a normal part of the way that we work in this space. Again, people should always be paid for experience, knowledge and wisdom. So when we're talking about the needs that we can see and wanting to find, that bringing those expertise voices, not just only women's, but men as well, and our children's.
Yeah, children. I mean, recognising children as victims in their own right, giving voice to children, the barriers to doing that work, it takes bravery. It takes a willingness to try things and do them differently. When
we actually pay our kids for their time and their expertise too, we don't actually give them cash. We pay them with like a gift card or a gift voucher, so they've got something that they can actually go and buy for themselves.
It's just demonstrating the value.
And it's educating how to budget their own needs and their own money.
Oh, even better. It's an educational opportunity. I love that. Nick, you spoke earlier a bit about the mental health and disability sectors, mental health being a lot further ahead than the domestic family violence sector and the disability sector, and having designated lived experience roles. What do you think we can learn from that?
Well, with the mental health sector, they're far more advanced when it comes to that sort of peer-led, peer workforce around sort of, having peer workers working within mental health spaces, within advocacy spaces for consumers of mental health services. So people who've experienced mental health then, go into a more structured role as, just beneath clinicians as support workers, and to support people through their journey or their advocacy, or supporting them when they're engaging with mental health services. So it's much more structured. It's becoming much more professionalised, and pushing for that to be recognised, at a higher pay rate even, which is where we're fighting for a sitting fee. They're actually looking at, we're a professional network and we need to be respected and paid as such as a professional network. I'm not a mental health peer, worker myself. But, the value of that for people, some of us need to be able to relate to the people around us. Relatability to lived experience really helps the person feel less alone. And it's a quite, really cathartic thing for people. Some people need that professional boundary and peer work is just too much for them and it's too close. But other people really gain a lot of value from that peer-led network, and we can really look to how the mental health space has done that, structured that, and actually made it a legitimate form of the workforce in a professional capacity. And how can that be applied into multiple other settings, say the family violence setting or within the disability setting? I'm quite surprised, and I reflect on the women's sector because we do it quite well. Like, we don't get paid a lot when we get a sitting fee, but majority of organisations now will always offer a nominal amount as a sitting fee. And coming into the disability sector and great big summits and forums, and like, oh, we don't have budget to pay you. I was like, but you understand that majority of us live below the poverty line, right? You're CEOs, you're promoting this to CEOs, you've got a lot of money, you're paying your caterers, you're paying your venue, but you're not paying for your content. Get your ducks in a row, look at the optics of what you're trying to do, and if the women's sector can do it on a razor-thin budget, you guys can do it when you're charging almost $1,000 a ticket. I'm really confronted that in that sector that seems to be a bit of a, oh, but we'll give you visibility. It's like, we don't need visibility. We need to be able to pay our bills, especially in this climate. We need, if you respect lived experience, then how much do you respect it if you haven't budgeted for lived experience? And I get, you're not going to pay a CEO to sit on a panel because they're getting their day wage. You want someone with lived experience to come in on a panel. They don't have a daily wage. They are there on Centrelink payments, whether it's DSP or whether it's New Start payments and things, which are well below the poverty line, and understanding that you're not going to pay the CEO, but you need to budget for people with lived experience who sit outside the workforce, who are there purely as a lived experience person to tell their story. You need to be able to respect that and pay that. And if the women's sector can do it, every other sector can do it.
And I know, we haven't had the opportunity really today to talk about the women's sector and the women's movement and the anti-racist movements, and recognise that through that knowledge, through that history, we do have what I call a lived experience workforce, and we do have challenges in recognising that as well. But I'm wondering, in hearing you speak, if that is potentially why there's been, and I wouldn't say it's perfect, but a greater pickup of recognising that value of lived expertise and paying for it, and acknowledging that there is an ethical piece to doing that, because maybe there's a greater shared experience of the professionals and the lived experience who are on those panels who are representing.
Well, I think it's also a part of understanding the practicing what you preach sort of thing has come, and the fact that even though you've got people in the women's sector who don't necessarily identify their lived experience, majority it's just statistically impossible that the people we're working with half the time have also got a lived experience, and it's that you're practicing what you preach, taking the lead, and if you're saying this is what you need to be doing, then actually doing that. And I think as women, and that feminist kind of lens and uplifting other people around us, that sort of really informs how we're doing it. But in other sectors, it's probably a little bit more behind the eight ball. And also, there's elements of stigma involved outside of the women's sector, I guess, when you start bringing in mental health or you start bringing in, different forms of disability, stigma and discrimination really permeates a lot of bits and pieces in the way in which people want to engage with you. We're often seen as less intelligent or less, capable as our able-bodied peers. So there's that element of ableism, there's that element of racism, there's that element of we're not as professional, we can't be as educated, but sort of pulling out that elitism, and that there are other ways to be a professional that don't necessarily come from university degrees, and that those values are still valid and important, and we're just as capable of contributing as everybody else. But the other bit is that I'm really cautious of in the disability sector is, how do you remunerate somebody who is living on Centrelink payments, who is living on a DSP,
Yep.
where you're not actually going to impact that DSP? And how can you remunerate someone whilst keeping that core safety net that they have to hold on to because they don't have anything else, you know, protected as much as possible, whilst also valuing them in the same instance as well, and being ready to be flexible based on, you know, individual circumstances for people from marginalised communities and people who do live in poverty.
And it's a lot of the same for women who are single parents and on single parenting payments. So we've addressed a lot of positive things that are occurring, a lot of recognition that's happening, change in how our systems are working. Clearly there's a lot that we still need to be doing across the board, but it's time now to open up to our Q&A, and I just got some of questions coming through on our trusty computer here, so I'm going to actually jump straight into some of them. So I've got a question here. As a frontline DV service, what can we, the DV service, learn from this research for respectfully and meaningfully engaging women with lived experience to inform our DV services and programs? I guess we did speak a fair bit about policy work, but Charlene, you spoke about developing programs, so I might throw to you for as a DV service who has done this work of developing programs, how can they take the knowledge that has been developed, not only, and I want to acknowledge here different ways and sources of knowledge, as you were just speaking about, Nicole. There is academic knowledge, which is a privileged set of knowledge, and then there's the knowledge which we all bring, which is the lived experience knowledge. So how do we combine those things into a DV service to develop our programs?
Well, education. Always referring to education, deep listening and two-way learning. Is that we educate women in our training about family and domestic violence, that there are different types of ways that women and children may respond to violence and trauma threats. So I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but yeah.
Can I pick up on something you did say just then? And I've heard this more recently, and it comes from Indigenous practice, deep listening. Can you tell me what that means and feels like in practice, and how can we change our very busy, overrun service system that is always like so many numbers out the door? What is deep listening really in practice, and how can we try to do it better?
Deep listening is not only listening with your ears, but it's also a sense of smell, the sense of touch, the sense of, I guess, the feel and what we see in the open, because it's all about observing. So deep listening is about observing in a way, and also the smell, because as Aboriginal people, we are taught from the very day we are born out on country. So deep listening is part of who is in me, and deeply who sits inside me, because deep listening kind of helps me keep the fire in my belly going and kind of educate other people as well around deep listening.
So can you do deep listening for yourself and for others?
Again, deep listening, yep, like you said, you do it for yourself in order, again, example of getting the respect. So if you want to get respect, you've got to respect yourself first. So that's kind of the way I interpret deep listening in ourselves, to kind of teach others what deep listening is. So when you're educating another person around deep listening, you're doing the two-way learning of understanding of deep listening.
I think that actually answers that question very well, because if we're doing the work respectfully and meaningfully, and a lot of your research and a lot of the tools that are being developed are really speaking to self-reflective practice first, thinking about our own bias, thinking about our prejudice, looking at the power that we hold in the situation where we're working with lived experience. And to me, that really resonates with what you were just saying of self-knowledge and sitting with yourself and learning yourself first, and then making the time and the space to really listen and be with another person, hear what they have to offer. And it's not just about hearing for a form or hearing for an outcome, it's about hearing for a whole person. So I think that answered that question beautifully. Thank you very much, Charlene.
Thank you.
We've got a question here. Lived experience consultations are the new buzzword, but often consultations are rushed and limited in scope, which limits our ability to do deep listening, making them a ticker box exercise. What recommendations does the panel have for making it a meaningful and in trauma-informed way of doing consultations? And I must start with Geraldine and then move to Nick and Lisa.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the way that we work is just as important as what we're doing, and particularly for lived experience engagement. And I think one of the most important things that we need to do around this type of consultation is be honest and transparent, particularly about the parameters of influence. So if we're going out to consultation and there are clear boundaries on what can be changed, that we're very honest and open about that, and that will help build trust between all the stakeholders and help to come to that positive place together.
So transparency and including that transparency, what we can do, what we can't do, and what your level of influence will be over what you're engaged in. And I think that's really important because for me, I see that as providing agency back to victim survivors who have often had their agency limited and their choices limited. But if you can just work with someone to say, we want to achieve this, this is the constraints that we're all bound by, here's the opportunity that you have in this process, and be really clear about it, then that person can make an informed choice as to what they want to do. And that's a really important part of offering agency, the transparency and the knowledge of how your contribution will influence a particular project. Nicole.
I think it's really being able to understand the audience that you're working with, who's not in the room, whose voices are being missed. But then also when you're creating a co-design or consultation space, it's also understanding the people that you're working with. And sometimes, a group space is not an appropriate space to do a lot of work. Sometimes it is being able to offer one-to-one work with people, one-to-one consultation with somebody. So if someone hasn't had the opportunity to do a lot of this work, they haven't had an opportunity to have their voice heard or validated. And then if you go into a large room of people and say, you don't need to talk about your lived experience, that's not what we're here to do today, we want to keep disclosures to a minimum. If someone has not been heard and they already feel marginalised, they already feel disempowered, the first instinct they feel is angry, and the first thing they want to do is disclose. And and then nobody wants to traumatise anybody else. But if you're telling somebody you're not to disclose, that's never had a chance to have visibility, they're going to disclose. So it's, if it's not somebody that's had a chance to engage very much, you've got to provide that one-to-one consultation space. So they've got the space to feel heard, they've got the space to say things the way they want to say them and how they need to say them, where they're safe and the other people in the room are safe. The issue is, and that I've found time and time again, you've got a room full of people with trauma, and mental health impacts from that trauma. Once one person discloses, another person discloses, and then you end up with this layering effect of, it's almost like a victim Olympics is the best way to kind of describe it. And it's not on purpose. It's just because you've been so downtrodden that you're desperately looking for validation. So therefore you're then, well, this happened to me and that happened to me. And you've got this competition going on without people even realising that they're doing it. And it's out of a need to feel validated because they're struggling to validate themselves. So give that space where you can openly listen and you can actually reflect back what you've heard and that's really bad. I'm so sorry. Thank you for sharing that with me, where it's not in a group space, where it's not going to escalate. But also, when people feel marginalised, and if they're in a room with other marginalised people and they feel like they have to defend their whole entire community, you end up with marginalisation trumps kind of thing. And you end up with people, trying to speak over people. Well, my voice is more valid because I've had this and this and this and this and this happen to me, or these are all my elements of diversity. So therefore, my voice is more important than your voice. It's not a deliberate act. It's not on purpose by the people who are doing it, but it's due to all of those ways of feeling oppressed and pushed down and not heard and not respected or validated. And if you're not creating engagement that is able to work with that, manage that, and validate that for people, it becomes quite damaging for for survivors in the room. And like I said, no one is doing this on purpose. No one is meaning that they're meaning to do it. But it's not after until you've been done you sort of experienced this a few times that you're able to critically reflect your own responses. You're able to not take on board somebody else's response or respond to their need to disclose, because it's about them, it's not about you. And it's such a long learning curve, but that learning shouldn't be done in an open room where other people can be harmed or where you can be harmed in the process. And it's respecting that and creating space for that. Because you can't stop it. You can't micromanage it. It's going to happen. No. You've got to prepare for it, and you've got to be ready to work with it and validate it and respect it.
For me, what I'm hearing from that is that's a lot about the intake process and skilled facilitation.
Yes.
Because it shouldn't be the case that people in the room feel the need to have to validate themselves. They should feel validated when they step into that space.
Yeah.
And so we need skilled facilitation around doing that work with lived experience and starting from a strengths-based approach. I can tell you the amount of times that I've changed the language on an opening intro on a group session or a consultation where I'm like, no, we're not going to say don't disclose. What we're going to say is you have been invited here and are valued for the lived expertise you bring. We all are carrying trauma. We need to be careful and respectful of that as how we work through this, but it doesn't mean that you are shut down because you're going to be talking about issues of domestic, family and sexual violence, gender-based violence. That is actually the purpose of why we're here. So I think we can do some smart, as you're saying before, language really matters, some ways of setting that up that are really important.
And people who are agreeing to it is, that haven't done it before, is creating those, you're sort of doing the one-to-one interviews.
The onboarding in.
And then sort of building them up to be in that group space. So they've had that validation, they've felt heard, and then they can then start to position their lived experience on a much sort of macro scale versus, this is just my trauma, because, victim survivors want to be heard. People who've been marginalised and been impacted want to be heard and validated. So bringing new people into the space is giving that one-to-one space for the opportunity to be heard where they're protected.
Yeah, absolutely. And an individualised approach to understand where someone is at first and what they might need from the process. I'm very conscious of time. We have two really good questions that I want to ask here. I'm not sure. The last one might be a little bit tricky, but I might open the floor actually and come back and leave the last question with Lisa, but this is a slightly, I just want to preface this question with going, there's a question that's come up about coercive control laws in the justice system. I know and respect from people on this panel right now that there has been a history with the advocacy around this, the way advocates have been used. I know that we have a difference of opinion in this room about coercive control laws and whether they're going to benefit or do more harm. And I want to ask the question, acknowledging that we have that difference, holding the space for the difference of opinion. How do we navigate different desired outcomes from those with lived experience? And I guess as I read that question out loud, I want to sort of say, well, why are we looking for one outcome? There's actually a problem in how the system is looking for a singular solution for a breadth, an issue that is very far-reaching and affects so many individuals. But given the knowledge and expertise that we have in this room about this issue, how do we navigate different desired outcomes from those with lived experience? Geraldine, I'll start with you, then Charlene and Nick.
Yeah, sure. And I think it is a really important question, and I don't think it's limited to coercive control. I think it's something that, particularly for policymakers, that we grapple with all the time, because no one solution will fit for every single experience. And what I think is really important for us as a survivor community is not to shame either side or anyone for wanting a desired outcome, whether that's a traditional criminal justice approach or whether that's something alternative to that. And I think what can happen is that we can have unity when we come back to exactly what you said, that no one single approach will fit for everyone. We are not a homogenous group, and having an understanding and a commitment to intersectionality and understanding that we need these different approaches is imperative to creating solutions that do work for everyone.
And I think providing multiple options actually is a really empowering thing. So if we're looking at creating systems and services that empower people, then we need to have options within our solutions. Charlene, how do you navigate, the very different desires from victim survivors who might want different things?
Sorry, I'm just a bit blanked out with that question again.
That's okay. Do you want me to go to Nick and come back to you?
Yes, please.
Great. Nick.
I think that it's understanding that any victim survivor perspective in that debate wasn't wrong. It was underestimated how personal that was for victim survivors, and that a lot of us came out feeling very damaged and very hurt from that. That did cause a lot of damage for survivors across the board on both sides of the camp. It was hard to have people, you know, in positions of power that you've worked with, that you trusted, that were saying, no, we know better than you. But we want to listen to victim survivors, but actually, no, your voice doesn't fit here because it doesn't fit our agenda. And I think that our positions were reasonably aligned in that, you know, survivors who were against this weren't saying that coercive control doesn't happen. We weren't saying that this isn't a serious form of violence. What we were saying is that the criminal justice system needs a hell of a lot of work to make it safe for people. If you're going to throw us into this system is inherently flawed, which we saw with Brittany Higgins, and we look at with sexual violence, which is now also being brought up. You know, we fail victims of sexual assault in courts all the time, but that's what we were saying. We're saying, like, don't just throw another law in there into a system where we're going to be damaged, where we're going to get hurt. What we also want to see is like massive system reforms that is going to take time, and it was really quite hard. And it was the fact that I think we all had very similar opinions, but I think there was a lot of professionals in the debate that felt very close to it, that possibly could have handled it a bit better. It was really hard to have to argue with other survivors and to feel hurt and to feel unheard in that process as well. But also then even putting forward that there has to be more than just a one-size-fits-all approach. We have marginalised communities that do not trust police, who are not safe in courtrooms, that will not go down that pathway, and we can't push people further away from the system. So what are we also going to develop that sits outside of the criminal justice system? Like, if we can't fully fix that, we can't make that safe for everybody, well, what other ways can we give victims, you know, the sense of justice? I got that justice in a courtroom, and I can tell you right now, it did not feel like justice. And that's why I felt very, very strong in my position, because it did not feel like justice. It was very damaging, the process. And if we tell survivors that this is the justice you want and this is the justice you need, then that's the only justice we're going to seek. What other ways can we achieve justice for survivors that works for them, that sits outside of that system? So there's more than one way to feel a sense of justice, and that it's not a one or the other. It's, you know, both of these things can be developed and worked on and discussed and debated in conjunction with each other. Absolutely. So that all survivors feel heard in the debate. But unfortunately, it was rough. All I can say, it was rough.
It was. And thank you for sharing. Charlene, did you have anything to add to that?
Around coercive control?
Yeah,
I agree with coercive control, but coming from an Aboriginal community, I feel a little bit unsafe having to bring in another layer, because that kind of adds another pressure for our community, especially when it comes to women and girls.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, again, I could talk about this particular issue for hours, but I'm looking at the time. I know I need to wrap it up, although I haven't been tapped on the shoulder yet by our lovely producer. So, Lisa, last question to you. While we recognise lived expertise as valuable, how do we effectively utilise the knowledge and experience alongside clinical or research-based knowledge effectively?
Great question. I think bringing people face to face is really important. And so from the interviews that I did, survivors loved working with a range of people with other expertise. So getting the same people in the room and getting face to face, I think is really, really important. And just that acknowledgement that gender-based violence is a really complex social problem. It overlaps every sort of government portfolio, from education to housing, everything. And it's going to take more than one sort of expertise to help make a dent in the prevalence rates. So I think, bringing people together in the same room, sharing that knowledge and that wisdom is really, really critical. And I just really wanted to thank you, Charlene, for the point that you made about deep listening. I just think it's such a valuable idea and really important. And certainly in my research, I learnt so much when I interviewed Fiona Hamilton. she really challenged me about being a white privileged woman doing this research. And I was like, should I not be doing it? And she said, yes, you should do it, but you need to read Indigenous academics. And it was just, you know, it's such a beneficial thing. So that approaching these discussions and these issues with kind of an open heart and an open mind, I think is really, really critical, and acknowledging that we've all got things to learn from one another for a whole lot of reasons.
Absolutely. On that, we've all got things to learn from each other. I'm going to wrap up now, and if I can ask you in one sentence for each panel member to give us their key message for the audience to take away today, and I'll start with Nick.
Oh God, come back to me.
Okay, I'll start with Geraldine.
My final takeaway today is to say that I think that valuing lived experience is not about individual celebrity, it's about collective movement building, and embedding lived experience into our work in this space is just about strengthening that collective movement.
Perfect. Love it. Charlene? One key takeaway message for our audience.
I'm going to refer to my hashtag, listen to us, stand with us and support us.
Fantastic. Nick?
I really don't know.
Lisa?
I'd say lived experience is incredibly powerful. It's a way for policymakers and service deliverers to see things that we wouldn't otherwise see, to see the obstacles that other people experience. And so it's really, really critical that we listen. But to do that, we need to change, because particularly for those of us that have worked in government, our systems and structures aren't really built for listening. They're primarily structures for holding and maintaining power. And so that means we need to change. That's my final message.
Nick?
Okay. I think, you know, the issue of the robust debate and discontent and disagreement is not a threat, and not to be seen as a threat, and how that actually is where we get to the value and the richness of ideas and the richness of a reform that encompasses all of the community, and that we're not always going to get along, but we can actually have that robust debate and, you know, get to the bottom of a problem, because this is confronting stuff. There's nothing nice about it, and sometimes the conversation, sometimes the debate is heated, and that's not a bad thing. It's not personal at anyone. It's just that it's personal for the individual. It's not personal against other people, and that you know, we can have that there. We need to be able to work with that, and we need to be able to harness that the debate. We can harness the discontent, you know, the disagreement, to actually, you know, to get to the crux of a problem, or to get to a resolution where we're listening to everybody without people feeling like their voice isn't welcome at certain points in time. Thank you.
Thanks to all my wonderful panellists. You've all contributed marvellously. I will quickly wrap up because I know time. So I just want to say again, the webinar recording will be available on ANRO's website and for on-demand viewing. So tell your colleagues and look at it whenever you like. The link to the survey is in the chat box now, so we really do greatly appreciate your feedback. For any researchers watching and tuning in today, if you're working on projects that address violence against women, gender-based violence, you can submit your project to the ANRO's Register of Active Research, otherwise known as the RAR, on the ANRO's website. That's a great way for other people to find it and for you to disseminate it. The RAR is a centralised and publicly available database of domestic and family sexual, I should say sexual, I'm sure sexual violence is in there. So domestic, family and sexual violence research currently underway. So I'm Lola Dembele. This has been my wonderful colleagues, Geraldine, Charlene, Lisa and Nicole. Thank you so much for letting us into your day, spending your time with us today. On behalf of ANRO's and the panel members, thank you very much.